Hey everyone, I'm out here in the garage with the Acura Legend behind me today. And that's because what we're going to be doing in today's video is replacing the alternator. So stay tuned. So the 1992 Acura Legend I have behind me, I've had this car for a very long time. I've talked about that several times on the channel. I absolutely love this car. I cannot get rid of it for some reason. And what happened recently was not the Legend's fault. Actually, I think it was the RL battery's fault. So I'll get a little bit into that. So what happened was one morning, I was on my way to work, went to start the RL, and it wouldn't start. And I noticed that the battery voltage was a little bit low, so I didn't have time to mess with jumping the car or anything. I swapped the battery out of this car, which was a new battery, and into the RL, and put the RL's battery in the Legend. So fast forward to the weekend when I went to start the Legend, I had the battery all charged up. That was the RL's old battery. And when I started the car, it ran for a few minutes and then it just shut off. And I noticed there was a battery warning light. So I took the battery down to the local AutoZone, had them check it out, and sure enough, the battery was faulty and not holding a charge. So I got a brand new battery, put that in the Legend. So that's what we'll pick up in this video and do some diagnosis on the alternator. So let's get into it. Alright, so here's a charging system warning light that came on as the car was running with a brand new battery installed. I'm going to start off the diagnosis by checking the battery's voltage. So what I've done here is hooked up the multimeter's red probe to the positive terminal and connected the black probe to the negative terminal. It's a little low at about 12.2 volts, and that's because the car was running purely off battery voltage. It's normally around 12.6 volts. Okay, so I'm going to start the car and see what happens here. And the voltage started to drop instead of rising to around 14 volts like it should. So basically the battery is not being charged while the car is running, and the car will eventually shut off. Next, I checked fuses 15 and 22 in the underdash fuse panel to see if they were blown, since they are tied into the alternator circuit. As you can see here, there's no break in the wire, so the fuses are just fine. I suspected the alternator was faulty at this point, but I wanted to see if it was getting power before declaring it faulty. So I disconnected the battery's negative cable, then the positive cable with a 10mm wrench. Then I removed the battery from the car. I then disconnected the horn and removed the metal tray, which is held in by four 10mm bolts. I also removed the bracket bolt on the alternator support so I could reach the alternator's green connector at the rear. I disconnected the green connector from the rear of the alternator and draped it down by the driver's side axle so I could test it with my multimeter. The battery needed to be reinstalled to complete the test, so there wasn't going to be much room to test the connector from above. Underneath the car, I used an alligator clip on the multimeter's black probe to attach it to body ground. Then I touched the red probe to these two terminals. The readings were nearly 12 volts, proving that the alternator is indeed getting power. Now, there are a couple other tests mentioned in the service manual involving the black cable that's connected to the rear of the alternator. But the test would either confirm a faulty alternator or a voltage regulator. The voltage regulator is housed in the alternator, and it's a bit pricey, so it just made sense to replace the alternator assembly. To remove the alternator, there's a 14mm bolt that goes through the engine bracket. That needs to be removed. A swivel socket seemed to work best, but you can play with various combinations of sockets and extensions. Next, the 12mm bolt that holds the belt tension adjuster in place needs to be removed. Then the belt can be removed from the alternator. Okay, to free the alternator from the engine bracket, I used a pry bar. The tricky part about removing the alternator is that it needs to be rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise in place. You can't just tip it to the left and pull it out. I found it easiest to rotate the alternator until the ear that the top bolt passes through is sitting in the alternator support's arch, for lack of a better term. I then pulled the alternator forward so that the ear cleared the arch and rotated it a few more degrees counterclockwise to complete the 90 degrees. I could then pull the alternator towards me and out. Once the alternator is out, the green connector needs to be disconnected if you put it back on at some point. Then the black cable needs to be disconnected by removing the 12mm nut, holding it in place. Lastly, there's a plastic clip that goes through a bracket on the rear of the alternator that I actually broke while trying to remove it, and this is how it's supposed to be removed. Here's a remanufactured pure energy alternator I'm going to install. Also, we'll need to transfer the bracket for the plastic clip onto the new alternator, and that's held on by a 10mm. Alright, so let's get our replacement alternator into the car. The process is basically the reverse of the removal, so I'll just reattach the cables, securing the black cable with the 12mm socket to 9 foot-pounds. Now you may choose at this point to reconnect the green connector later, and that might make it easier to wrestle the alternator back into place. Next, I position the alternator 90 degrees counterclockwise like we removed it, and at this point I would reattach the plastic clip to the bracket at the rear of the alternator. I then rotated the alternator into position until the top ear was just in front of the alternator's support arch, again for lack of a better term, and slid it straight back with a little wrestling. It's then just a matter of setting the alternator's lower ear into the engine bracket, reinserting the lower 14mm bolt, and reattaching the adjuster with the 12mm bolt. Watch the alternator belt replacement video before tightening these bolts. Okay, to finish up this job, I reinstalled the metal battery tray with the 4 10mm bolts. Reconnected the horn. Set the plastic battery holder on top of the metal tray. Battery terminals can then be reconnected with a 10mm wrench, reconnecting the positive, then the negative. Alright, so we've got the battery back in the car and we're going to give this a shot again. So what I've done is I've hooked up the multimeter with the red probe on the positive terminal, black probe on the negative terminal, and we've got about 12.2 volts before the car is started. And it shot up to around 14 volts when the car is running, so that's good. Alright, so there you have it. There's the alternator replacement in the 1992 Acura Legend. Pretty simple. There is a little bit of a catch when you try to pull the alternator out. I noticed, as you saw in the video, that I had to tilt it one way, get it through that little arch in the alternator bracket, and then pull it forward a little bit more and tilt it again. So that seemed to work pretty well. So hopefully this information was helpful, and thanks for watching.